of mental health. And I think to get us started on that, I'm going to have Jeff come on up and talk about the deeper issues related to the matter of school violence that go beyond mental health.
Okay. Good evening. I'm going to argue that the way we approach a solution to the school shootings and the violence in our society is to focus in on the root cause of a spiritual void in our culture. And I'm not, that isn't to say that I don't think there should be some things done politically and economically in other areas. But I don't want to get into that right now, that debate, because I don't think it goes deep enough to the real cause. And we heard Jordan Peterson talk about the nihilism. I don't know if all of you know what that term is, what that means, what that concept means, but it's simply put, it's this attitude of hopeless despair, bleak. When you look at the future, there's only darkness. There's no hope in sight. You can't find any answers in church. The government is corrupt. And it's just on and on. Negative looking perspective that says there's no hope, there's nothing to live for, suicide's the only answer, that kind of thing. No. So nihilism is a very dark philosophy. And what I'm going to say tonight is that we are breeding nihilism in our culture because we are undermining spiritual and moral values. Every time we are hostile, every time the government's hostile toward the Christian faith and the church, it's breeding nihilism. It's breeding this dark despair. Now, Jordan Peterson was talking about, you need meaning and purpose in your life, and you can get that by clarifying goals and things like that. I think it was kind of his own personal philosophy. I would disagree with him on that point. Historically, the way most people on this planet have found meaning and purpose in life is through spiritual faith, not through coming up with their own philosophy of life and everything like that. I think, if I understand Jordan Peterson correctly, he is a Christian of sorts. He symbolizes Christianity, though, more in a Carl Jung way, where he sees the cross as a symbol for this, and he sees Jesus as representing this, and so it's a very symbolic kind of Christianity, not what you would call Orthodox Christianity, not what you would call Bible-believing Christianity. So he goes off a little bit on that, but he's right on the diagnosis. It is because of a lack of meaning and purpose in life that a lot of these violent shootings occur. I think specifically of the one out in Las Vegas. I remember right after that happened, people were scrambling. Experts were called in. Why did this man do this? What was the motive for it? Well, we're many, many months later, and they still haven't come any closer to a motive. And when I began to look at that shooting in Las Vegas, I began to say, this guy is a first-class nihilist. And then I began to hear some other commentators actually on network TV talk in terms of this guy is a nihilist. He doesn't have faith in God. He probably doesn't have any faith in the government, can't trust the government. Politicians, can't listen to them, can't believe them. Family, society, Western culture. I think if you were to go down the list, he would shoot them all down. And he had nothing to live for, and so he had decided that he was going to take himself out and maybe take other people with him. Very dark, nihilistic philosophy. Well, if you can imagine that happening in the mind of an adult shooter, what's going on in the mind of these teenage kids when they're experiencing the pain of teenage years? And I think if I remember back in teenage years, and if you remember back in your teenage years, little things could become real big things. And you don't really know how to process life. And for most people in this country, for most of our history, we process life through our Christian faith and churches, and you talk to the pastor, and you you're part of this community of faith that can help you and teach you things. You turn to the Bible. Jesus gives counsel. The apostles, the Old Testament struggles with, Moses, and the Jews were struggling with Pharaoh, and all these trials and tribulations. You could draw faith and encourage from these accounts. And today, unfortunately, this is being undermined and undercut. So we're living in an increasingly de-Christianized society, and in its place is a secular society. And so what I want to say is we will never be able to address the problem with violence unless we go to the root of this and realize we're dealing with a spiritual sickness. It's a spiritual sickness in our society. We have a sickness of soul in our country. You might want to put it that way collectively. And it's showing up especially in the young people today. If you go to the Bible in Matthew 4, 1 through 4, it says that Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered him, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Now, here you have the devil tempting Jesus to turn these stones into bread. In other words, fulfill your immediate desire. You're hungry. You've been fasting 40 days. Turn these stones into bread. Solve your immediate problem. And don't worry about your long-term mission as Messiah. Don't worry about going to the cross to save the world from its sins. You worry about your material need at the present time. And I think we can learn from this passage, Jesus said no to that. He said, man does not live on bread alone. And you can analyze this passage and go into a greater depth. But to summarize it quickly, you might say that the devil was trying to get Jesus to look at the material world only and to forget about that spiritual world. And so too today we're tempted when we look at problems that we face in life. We're tempted because of our secular society that we live in today. A world of science and a world of rational, logical thought, and a world of experts and the universities and the academia and the media, and everything is a secular, this worldly emphasis. And we're tempted when we run into violence like the school shootings, we're tempted to go, we've got to find a political solution and get this solved. Or we have to go to the government and demand that they do this or that or the other. It's kind of disappointing to see teenagers at such young age, when they experience a tragedy like they had to go through down in Florida, to automatically turn to the politicians for answers. That's really pathetic. And that never used to happen in this country. They would turn to the churches. They would turn to prayer. They would turn to their families. They would turn to their community. And these problems would be processed in an entirely different way. But today, what did we see with all the students, at least the ones that were covered in the television reports? They're demanding that Trump, and demanding our government, and demanding their senators, and they aren't asking for this. They're demanding, they're telling, do this specific political policy, as if that is the solution, no question about it. And what I want to say is that's a superficial way of looking at the problem. The problem is a spiritual problem, and we need to address it at a spiritual level. Now, if you look at the signs of the sicknesses all around us, you'll no doubt come to the conclusion we have a spiritual problem. Although it's hard to get that diagnosis acknowledged in our secular world, because Our secular world tends to look at everything through the eyes of material natural causes, cause-effect. It's sort of like the old adage, if the only thing you have in your toolbox is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And you hit it because that's what you have. You have a hammer, and that's the only tool you have. And it's kind of like that in our secular world. Everything has to be a material, political, economic, psychological solution, because those are the tools we have. And the great neglect here is to look at what society has been doing for thousands and thousands and thousands of years to deal with a lot of these deeper problems, and that is to look to our faith, and look to Christianity, and look to our churches, and look to the spiritual problems, and not just try to solve everything on a political level. Because we're going to come to the realization, and I don't know when it's going to come, but our society has got to come to the point where we realize not everything can be solved by a political solution. Not everything can be solved by voting in some new politician or better politician or some better policy or some government program. We have to come to the realization that there are sicknesses that are not going to yield to political solutions. There's a quote from Walter Lippmann in his A Preface to Morals that says, "These are perhaps merely the rationalizations of modern man's discontent. At the heart of it, there are likely to be moments of blank misgiving in which he finds that the civilization of which he is a part leaves a dusty taste in his mouth. He may be very busy with many things, but he discovers that they no longer are worth doing. He has been preoccupied, but he is no longer sure that he knows why. He has become involved in an elaborate routine of pleasures, and they do not seem to amuse him anymore. He finds it hard to believe that doing any one thing is better than doing any other thing, or, in fact, that it is better than doing nothing at all. It occurs to him that it is a great deal of trouble to live, and that even in the best of lives, the thrills are few and far between. He begins more and more, less consciously, to seek satisfactions because he is no longer satisfied, and all the while he realizes that the pursuit of happiness was always a most unhappy quest." And that's Walter Lippmann. It's kind of that nihilism and if you were to talk to a lot of the younger people today, you would really pick up on that. I think older adults don't understand quite as well the feelings of the younger generation. They really don't have much optimism and faith in the future. They really don't. As the older we are, we have that memory, that Christian civilization memory, that we've learned some things in church. We were Sunday schooled to some extent. Most of the older people can name some of the Ten Commandments, or most of the Ten Commandments. We understand and recognize quotes by Jesus and the apostles. And we have this sort of thing to fall back on when we have to go through struggles of life. But when you look at the younger generation, they don't have a whole lot to fall back on because they were growing up in a rapidly secularized culture. And so if you were to ask them about, for example, what would be the consolation you might find in the Bible after a mass shooting or some kind of act of violence, they wouldn't have a clue as to where to go. They wouldn't have a clue as to how to begin to pray or to begin to draw upon the faith that sustained generation after generation before them. They don't have that. And so a lot of these young people, not having any foundation, not having anything to fall back onto, they just don't have any way of dealing with life's disappointments. I think Jordan Peterson was talking about the fact that, hey, life presents these struggles and problems and hardships, and if you don't have the wherewithal to deal with those, you're going to do so in an unhealthy way, and that's exactly what we're seeing. Now, it's also a fact that our culture is becoming less and less Christian and more secularized. And this isn't just from the pastors and spiritual leaders and denominational leaders and Christians. This isn't just the opinion of the religious folk. This is the analysis of non-Christian cultural commentators. There's no question that when you look back at the last 50 years, our culture is changing in a secularized manner. And one expert put it this way: this Western society today that we live in is the first one ever in the history of humanity that is trying to build on a non-religious foundation. The first one ever. And we're trying to do that, and it's slowly but surely working its way out. Now, in Russia, under communism, that was an imposed secular atheism. It came from the revolution. The leaders imposed it on the population, and it took quite a number of decades for the people to basically throw that off and reject that, and they did. In China, a little bit different situation. It was imposed on the people, but they have a more of a enclosed isolation over there, and it's still undetermined how long it's going to take for communism to be rejected. I really do believe it will be rejected at some point in China, but it's hard to know how that will happen. It was hard to realize and even foresee that it would happen in Russia, but it did. But that was an imposition of secularism. We in the West, we are gradually, more and more, the population of our own culture is gradually embracing the secularism. We're voting in, little by little, more secularization in our society. There are exceptions, of course, the impositions of the court, coming down with rulings that secularize society through imposition of power. But for the most part in the West, we're actually just voluntarily becoming a secular society. And we see this especially, for example, in the public schools. We see, for example, in the 60s, school children said a little prayer, sort of an innocuous prayer. Generic, God, thank you for this day, bless our school, very generic. But that was too religious. And so Madalyn Murray O'Hara, an American atheist, got together, took this to the courts, and in the 60s, prayer was basically prohibited in public schools. So we don't have that. We also have seen the rejection of any hint that God might have been involved in some way in the putting together of the universe, the planet Earth, and human life. Now, we're not talking about a full-blown Genesis creation taught in the public schools. We're talking about the idea that there was some possible intelligent design involved in putting together human life. And that is such a dangerous idea, according to the courts, that is illegal now. And the only viewpoint in public schools that you can teach is that we evolved basically through the process of evolution, and if you listen to the scientists, without even God involved, and there's no need for him if you understand the whole theory of evolution. So this radical secularism is spreading all throughout society. It's all over the public schools. And for example, just a couple days ago, Stephen Hawking, the great famous, probably the most famous scientist in the earth today, on the earth before he died, was quoted for the last 10 years running around here and there saying, there is no God. Scientifically speaking, there is no God. Now, in the public schools today and the universities, you can quote Stephen Hawking in saying that there is no God, but you cannot quote Moses or Jesus that says there is a God. And that's because of the radical secularism that has swept through our culture. So what is the solution? What can we do if this indeed is the truth, that our culture is becoming more secular and that the results of this secular process end up in producing a nihilism, a sort of a bleak, dark philosophy that doesn't give any meaning and purpose in life. It has no answer to morality. There's no absolute right and wrong. The current understanding of morality is that it's a social construct, that all morality, all right and wrong is simply the creation of humans and the pragmatic working out of rules for society. And that's the dominant thought in schools today. And so this nihilism is pervasive, and it's getting darker and darker. It's not just government institutions, it's the media, it's television, it's movies. When I was a kid, Batman was sort of a goofy lampoon of superheroes on TV, and it was kind of funny. It wasn't very dark and deep and everything. But if you go to see, for example, the Batman movies, The Dark Knight, the Joker, who used to be nothing like this, became this nihilistic, dark figure who had given up all hope in civilization and just wanted to lash out. And so kids absorb this stuff, and that becomes part of their thinking. So what are some of the things we can do to counteract this? Well, there is something. First of all, I said that the answer is not politics and government. Well, there is something that politicians and the government can do, and that is stop assaulting people of faith. Stop making them feel second class. Stop being hostile to Christian morality. Wasn't it John Adams who said, America is made for a religious people, and it cannot exist under any other type? Okay, if we really believe that America was set up for a religious people, and that it can't exist without people who have faith in God, who have belief in right and wrong, belief in a divine judgment to come, that their actions are being held accountable by a judge, a God, a greater God, and that even if they lose their life, they will still be accountable in the next life. If we really believe that, then we have to tell our politicians to stop being hostile to Christians and other people as they draw meaning and purpose from the Bible. And churches and communities of faith, we have to petition them and let them know we don't want to go the way of secular society, because that robs all of us of meaning and purpose. It robs us of ethical, moral values. And then there are other things we can do. Churches have to really get back to what their original purpose was set up for. Jesus set up the church to be the salt of the earth. We have to teach people moral and spiritual values, even if they conflict with society. See, a lot of churches today, they say, well, we're losing the grip on people. We're losing influence in society. So we have to water down our message to the point where we get to the point where people feel comfortable in coming in. And what we have to do is say, no, we have to teach the core values of morality and spirituality, and even if society is rejecting those. Because you never know what society's going to do. It could be hostile to those values today, and then 50 years from now, it can change. and all of a sudden, now they're embracing these things. And so as the church, we can't go zig and zag with our culture. We have to actually stand firm and preach what we believe and we know is from God. And the families have to begin to reinforce these values in the home also, and not take the attitude, well, I don't want to impose my faith on my children. You have to give them a foundation. You have to give them a moral and spiritual foundation. And if you don't, you are part of the reason why the young people are drifting and they're lost. You know, when we look out at our school shootings and this shooter in Florida, that kid is lost. He hasn't any clue. And there are a lot of other kids just like him. And we're going to see more and more of this until we begin to tell our leaders in community and our government, hey, you guys are missing the whole thing. This is a spiritual problem. This is a moral problem. This is something that you need to begin to listen to the Christian leaders and the spiritual leaders and the church leaders as they explain that these things are coming about because of a lack of meaning and purpose in people's lives today. You know, the malls are filled with all kinds of good, shiny, nice toys. That doesn't fill your soul. An education doesn't fill your soul. A high-paying job doesn't fulfill the deepest thing in your soul. Only a relationship with God can give a life meaning and purpose. Only a relationship with God can give you guidance to know what is right and wrong, and to give you guidance in life. And the words of Christ, they're applicable today as they were 2,000 years ago, where he said, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. I think that's about says it.
I've been pulling in a big amen for a long time.